Well, good afternoon and welcome to our Wednesday webinar. And thank you for joining us, whether you're watching us live or whether seeing this as a recording later on. My name is Tim Ferguson and I'm part of the ministries team at the Baptist Union. I was about to say that we're at Didcot. Of course, at the moment we're not. We're all working from home, as I'm sure we all are. We hope over the coming weeks to host a number of webinars on different topics. And for the time being, they're going to concentrate on our response to the coronavirus pandemic. So do keep an eye on the Baptist Together website. And if you go to the coronavirus pages and then to the webinar pages, it will list the topics that we're going to be looking at. I do want to say, however, we don't have a webinar next Wednesday in the week after Easter, but a couple of weeks' time after that we should have. So today, the topic we're going to look at is how we might handle sudden or multiple deaths. Usually, of course, we have plenty of time to sit with and walk a family through the process of bereavement and then to celebrate the life of the person that's died at the funeral. And it can be sometimes a very rich experience of ministry. However, of course, at the moment, everything has changed. And some of us already may be having to support families who have lost a loved one suddenly, possibly without being able to see them before they die. And they then may be facing a funeral with few, in fact, if any, mourners present. So in the coming days, we might be juggling a number of these cases at the same time. So I'm delighted today to be joined by Baptist ministers, Jonathan Woodhouse and Cole Maynard. And they both bring considerable experience of handling these issues through their work as army chaplains. And if I can just introduce both of them to you, Jonathan was a church pastor for 10 years before becoming an army chaplain in 1990 and serving in various regiments, various places around the world. And over time, Jonathan rose to become the chaplain general, managing all 230 army chaplains in the British Army before retiring in 2014. Jonathan is now, by the way, convener of the United Navy, Army and Air Force Board that interviews, commends and supports Free Church chaplains. Cole is senior minister at Colchester Baptist Church, and he came to ministry in the 1980s after a stint in the RAF and went back to support the forces as an army chaplain for 11 years, travelling to Iraq, Afghanistan, South Sudan and other places. He finished his time in the army as a senior chaplain for Scotland. So Jonathan and Cole, can I just say welcome to both of you and thank you so much for joining us today. We are, by the way, hoping this will be a conversation. So folks, if you have questions that you want to ask, you have a comments box on the right. Do add some comments there, and we hope that by the end of the broadcast we should have answered some of the questions that will be there. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Jonathan, first of all, Jonathan, whether you'll start us off just by saying something about the timing of our initial approach to families that have been bereaved in these circumstances.
No, Tim, thank you very much. I want to say at the outset that neither Cole nor I are smart experts in any of this, but there is perhaps some experience we can bring to bear in these difficult days. In terms of timing, one of the automatic things that we knew within the military, and they discovered this for some years, that any chaplain, any minister should never be the bearer of bad news. That was a fallback position every single time, which assisted us actually in the business of pastoral care and spiritual support after that news was broken. That can be different in a pastoral setting, though with coronavirus now, one understands the difficulties of it, but many in civilian pastoral situations where a minister might be present with a family at death, either in hospital or in a home, simply would not be the case in the same way. We would not be the bearer of bad news, and that's quite important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Cole, that's your experience too?
Absolutely. I think the army initially got it wrong, and it was a learning curve for us, because I think the default setting was send the padre. Death, padres know all about death. And I think it was a lot of really good research was done, and we became, the army began to lead it for the Navy and the Air Force. And we developed what was called a notification officer who notified the death, and a visiting officer who went in on the heels of the notification officer, and he was the one that's assisted the family. And that's what the pastor is. We're there to assist the family. What we discovered was that the person that brings the bad news is forever that person who's the bearer of bad news, but not gospel. They're bad news people, and that can really damage the relationship, because initially there wasn't a notification officer, there was just a visiting officer, and a lot of them having to overcome that hurdle of being the bearer of bad news. And so we divided it into two roles, and the pressure can be sometimes that police officers, if they want to give the bad news, have got no experience of this, and they will see you as the minister and say, can you do this for me? Or even in a hospital context, medical staff can say, well, you're the minister, can you do that? And it's really to try and not do that, because we should be there to bring the good news and not necessarily the bad news. It can damage the relationship.
Yeah. And Cole, if I could perhaps stay with you and just say, sort of overall, what is it that we are aiming to do or to be when we're dealing with a tragedy like a sudden death?
Well, the great difficulties that COVID throws at us is that and the buzzword for chaplains is a ministry of presence. It's incarnational. You're right there with the family throughout, and with the soldiers, wherever the soldiers are, thick and thin, you're right beside them in uniform. You're sharing the danger and you're sharing the pain, and that's the greatest thing that we can bring as ministers. The difficulty we have in the context of the coronavirus is we can't necessarily always be there physically. We're going to be there virtually. It's how we overcome that. But I think it is learning just to be alongside people and be with them however they are. In a war context where people are dying, and it's often very grisly and gruesome, a lot of fear, a lot of emotion, you've simply got to be there. So if they rage, we listen. If they cry, we listen. If they stare in silence and have nothing to say, we're with them and we listen. And the one thing we never stop doing is praying for them and for ourselves in our hearts. I mean, countless times I've been either with families or in a combat situation where I'm with a soldier and I have not got those words because there are no words. And so you're really praying. I mean, I'm praying constantly, God, give me the word, help me, give me wisdom, show me what to do and what to say. And it's incredible the way that the Holy Spirit can just give you a little prompt in your mind, and you do something that really resonates with that individual or with that family in that time, because you're constantly praying and dependent, because you don't have, as Jonathan's saying, we're not the experts, we are vulnerable, but in that vulnerability, we are most often able to be used by God because we're open to him to prompt us. And I think that presence, though, is really, really important. And what I would say on this is that in this current situation where we're unable to be physically in that trench or in that forward operating base as you would be in the military, you can use the power of our platforms that we've got now to be constantly in contact with the family through phone calls and what have you. And the power of the phone call, it is quite incredible, because you are close to someone's ear when you're speaking to them. It's quite an intimate thing you're doing when you're doing a phone call with someone. But in that phone call, it's really important not to be afraid of silences, because when someone's just lost someone and you're close on the heels of someone who's just bore this terrible news that's wrecked their day, and that day will always be a black day for them, there's got to be that silence, and it's us praying silently into that silence and not being uncomfortable, just being confident in that silence. The way I describe it is often it's like someone's parked in the garage and their foot is in the car, they're sitting in the car, the ignition's on, their foot is fully on the accelerator, the engine is raging, but the other foot's fully on the brake. So they're not going anywhere, but the engine is screaming. And often in those immediate hours and days after the news is broken, that's where they are. Their engine is screaming. So that silence is not silence to them, it's silence to you. So being there and listening, and not only listening, but also I think what's really, really important in that conversation is to offer prayer, but with confidence. One of the things that Jonathan and I learned very early on in our experience in the military is the soldiers do expect you to be a God botherer. You are a sky pilot. You are the one who stands in the gap between them and God. So if anyone can pray, the padre, the pastor, the minister, is that praying person. And I think sometimes as Brits, we can get bit so reluctant to pray on the phone, but offer to pray, say, can I pray with you? As if it's the most natural thing in the world. And I've found actually recently with the coronavirus, ending a call with people and offering to pray, that's been a point where the Holy Spirit has touched that life. That person has then wept a tear or two, and there's been a real, it's been the opening of a floodgate that's enabled that relationship, that pastoral relationship, to go deeper. So don't be afraid of silences on the phone, and don't be afraid of offering prayer. You know, if we can't pray, who can?
Yeah. You mentioned
the other factor I would say in that is the physicality. Incarnation means being material, being physical, and we can't be in a virtual space. But actually, on a Zoom call or a Skype call or some other platform too, we can be physical virtually, and that's quite important too. So being able to just be present, and sometimes even on a picture, on a video piece, you don't always have to fill the gaps with words. You can physically just be there. That business of presence, even virtually, is very, very key, I think.
Yeah. And Cole mentioned that sometimes you're dealing with people raging at you. Jonathan, I just wonder, anger obviously is one of the stages of dealing with grief, and it can come quite quickly sometimes. How do you suggest we manage that anger that might be aimed towards us?
I think it's a very hard thing to manage, because as a minister, you are representing something else and someone else. And you have to take sometimes, not literally on the chin, but you do have to take some of the hits that people will throw at you. It's not intentional on their part at all. And this surprises some people, particularly Christians, are quite surprised by their own anger and irritation and invective that can be there in grief. And as a minister, you just have to be aware that can come flying at you. It's nothing personal, it's just there. And being able to manage it is quite a difficult thing, really. An experience of that was in a multiple death situation with 6 soldiers who were killed, and eventually getting back and being with the parents. A whole range of emotions at different times. So one set of parents were more accepting at one time, another set of parents were deeply angry and wanting to blame, and so on and so on. And then it would change amongst the dynamics of the 6. So you have to be prepared for that. And I suppose it's towards that business of resilience, which I'm sure we'll touch on as we go through.
Yeah. Cole, I wonder where we've got funerals at the moment where there may be very few people present, or because of the illness of the bereaved or their proximity with the person that's died, they themselves can't actually attend, maybe even a spouse's funeral. How do you help families in those circumstances where they can't be at that critical event? How do you best honour the deceased also when perhaps a full tribute isn't possible, and so on and so forth?
Well, I think there's various things that we do. I mean, in an operational theatre, soldiers, their job carried on, and we had to provide an opportunity for them to remember the fallen. That's really, really important. Adding dignity to death. This isn't the death of a cat or a dog, although that may have huge repercussions in a family. The reality is this is the death of someone who bears the image of God. These are special. These are people. And that dignity in death is really, really important. So we'd always find an opportunity. And normally what we would try and do is put a minister, a chaplain, right into that fob where if there wasn't one already, where he can go around and minister in different ways. And it's been very flexible and seeing again that listening to that prompting, how you can minister in that situation. I mean, obviously, if you're we're looking at probably doing a situation which would be like a committal at a graveside if things really ramp up in this country, in which case it's doing something that's significant And I think what always is very important is to use the person's name repeatedly, to refer to the person, not to generalize. You may want to generalize over the cause of death because there won't be enough time to do something too good, and that's particularly a key thing in a multiple casualty situation. But the use of symbols, I think, is really, really important here. How you can get people to reflect. We won the, I mean, as a Baptist, I remember when you're praying with someone, either virtually, you can have a candle there and you light the candle at a certain time, or if you're in a physical group, a group of soldiers, and have a candle in the middle, because as the candle to give light is consumed by the flame, and Jesus to give light to the world was consumed by dying for us on the cross. Which is a wonderful symbol.
I think it's really interesting too, because just looking at something else that's on the web, on the Baptist BUGB web site, when Alex Drew, who writes about taking a funeral of her father on the 25th of March, whereby in that she encouraged people to light a candle and dress smartly, actually, as if they were going to a funeral, but to do it virtually. And this is back to the business of using symbols and not to be embarrassed by them. And actually, if protocols allow, not virtually, but if protocols allow, and they can do in a hospital, anointing a body with oil, the sign of the cross on the forehead. So this morning, the Bishop of Portsmouth, the Catholic Bishop of Portsmouth, was speaking about some of his Catholic chaplains being able, with PPE on, to minister in circumstances where that might be possible, but using PPE. So those sorts of things too are relevant. I can recall them actually as a Baptist anointing someone who was very, very seriously ill and wired up in a forward field hospital base in southern Iraq, and a young officer who was not going to survive. And so to be able to use something that symbolized something which might in fact be of assurance to his parents, for example, is quite a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's key, and what Jonathan said there, because in these environments where you're dealing with, there's the chaos of lots of death, is that symbols are great because they're visual, they speak above the chaos, they speak above the noise. And what Jonathan said is absolutely right. Iraq, for me, after Iraq 2003, I always carried every day, wherever I went, in my pocket, I carried a bag like this, in which I had a stole, a small stole, and I carried oil in a small file. Kind of, you can see that.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you.
Yeah. And it's actually really important. So I got into habits as a Baptist, as a nonconformist, anointing everybody of all the soldiers that I repatriated from Iraq or Afghanistan. And one of the reasons I did that was because it's not just for the family, it's also for the medical staff. This is a person who's died, and medical staff often get great relief and comfort out of the minister being there and saying some prayers over the body of the person, even obviously before they die, if that's the best case scenario, where you can pray for them and be with them. And that happened very recently with a Gurkha family in Colchester here, but also being there at the point of death, and likewise with the family gathered around the bed. It was a great source of comfort, even though they would be more likely as a family, more likely to be Pentecostal than they were to be Anglo-Catholic. But it's also very good for us, because it gives you as the pastor and the minister something formal to do, something visual to do in the face of death. And so I laminated my prayers. You can see them on this paper here. I carry them in my pocket at all times on operations, and I've done that ever since 2003, because that symbolism was really, really powerful. And often it wasn't just the family who came back and thanked me for that. It would often be the medical staff who were looking for something to dignify and give them hope, bring light into their darkness.
Yeah. Can I just, Jonathan mentioned in passing, by the way, the article by Alex Drew on the experience of taking her father's funeral. And if you want to look for that, that's on the coronavirus pages under grief and bereavement on the Duchess Together website. Do have a look at that if you want to. Can I also say we've had a few comments come in? Thank you. Do keep them coming. We're going to address them after we've gone through a number of questions with Jonathan and with Cole. But if there's a list there for me to look at in a bit, that would be great. So do keep submitting those. We touched briefly, or Cole touched briefly there, on what we might do if you have more than one death at one moment. Jonathan, obviously in conflict, you have to deal sometimes with simultaneous deaths, and I just wonder how you best shoulder the load of several individual tragedies at the same time.
Well, of course, there are the practicalities of what that means, and the practicalities involve the reality of several coffins, for example, at once, and to be able to say words which apply to all of those whom you are remembering and commending to God in prayer, and for those who are around that event. The key thing really is to ensure that each name is mentioned, and the key thing also is to ensure that it is brief and to the point, because these cannot be long events. They can draw attention from other people in an operational setting. But when we're talking about virtual setting now, that's equally true. That you have to, I suppose, and the experience certainly of Alex Drew was this, as she recounted the funeral of her father and how they arranged it, was the whole business of virtual, both using symbol, but also being fairly brief. That's fairly key when it's multiple casualties. And what I would say is the experience of 6 who died at one time, and the experience of being in a service with the parents, and in one case with a bereaved wife. In that Thanksgiving, we would use 6 candles. We would, to represent the light, we'd use 6 photographs. We would use 6 brief sentences for each, but then there'd be a generalized service of word, which indicated this was a group, but they were individuals too. So you've got to adapt. You've got to think through how you're going to manage it, but to individualize it, you do it briefly, and then the generalized service is for all, and you have to indicate that too.
Yeah, okay. Cole, I imagine that you are sometimes been involved with taking funerals for those you've actually known quite well within the forces, and that may well be the case for some of our ministers within the congregations, but also just maybe dealing with difficult circumstances, unusual circumstances. It will take an emotional toll on the minister themselves. So I just wonder whether you have any comments about how we can deal with our own emotions in ministering in this situation.
This is quite a key point, because ever since Princess Diana died, there's been a rise in what is described as sentimentality in our society. And it's very interesting very recently to hear the 2 sons of the 2 princes talking about their own sense of outrage by some of the emotion that was poured out at the death of their mother, because they were saying, this isn't your mother, this is our mother. Where's this coming from? And I think as ministers, we've got to have a degree of detachment, not because we don't feel emotional, or not because we don't feel some of the pain, but simply because we're there to help the family. I had a case, I had 21 deaths when I was looking after the northwest of England over a period of 2.5 years of soldiers dying. And I remember once we had one of the guys that went in as a visitation officer, who volunteered, and the unit very foolishly allowed him to come, and he was his best mate, the guy who had died, and he was absolutely useless because he kept on breaking down. He kept on, he was living by his emotions, and I was having to deal with him as well as looking after the family, and it became a real problem. And I think as a minister, our focus is on their grief. That's where our focus needs to be, not on my grief. And we've got to put that aside, and and help the family. Now, it could be that when you get home with your partner, whatever, you may shed a tear or whatever, or allow some of that emotion to come to the surface. But when we're in that family situation, we are there to care for them, and so we're not. Sentimentality is something which, let's be caring, absolutely. Let's be a pastor, absolutely. But let's not become so overcome by that emotion that we can't function and minister.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And I remember taking a funeral of a 25-year-old officer whose father was a brigadier in the British Army, and I knew both of them. They lived up the road from me, up the street, and I'd met the son several times, walking, running his dog. I knew the father very well, and the son tragically died on returning to UK with serious injuries. And taking that funeral, hugely charged with emotion, and a significant number of people there, massive emotion, and to try and focus very much, as Cole says, on their grief. It's the balance between empathy and emotion is quite a key one to get right. So to be as empathetic as possible is absolutely right. I knew both of them. And here's a father saying goodbye to his son in front of 600 people. No COVID-19 around at that time. But emotion, huge emotion, having to stay empathetic and actually, if I may say, professional, because they did not want me to break down, but to focus on what was, focus actually on helping them to carry through that service and the sentiments they wanted to express. So in those circumstances, it is just not easy. But I've always held that in my thinking, empathy, emotion, how am I going to balance them off? And where am I going to go with it? I want to go down the middle line with it.
Yeah.
I'm also aware that ministers will be carrying this burden differently. Some at the moment will have a number of funerals in a short period of time. Others, their churches and communities may be relatively untouched. So I guess there is also the opportunity for ministers to lean on each other in this time, particularly just for support, and perhaps sometimes sharing the load actually of the funerals themselves. I'm sure that's communities and ministers' gatherings will be seeking to do that. So we don't know at the moment how long this current situation is going to go on for. It's very uncertain days. We may be rushing around now, but perhaps, Cole, I just wonder, how do we, well, maybe I could address this to Jonathan. I mean, how do we deal with this in the long haul? If this is going to take some time, how do we pace ourselves for this season of loss?
It's a great question, and it's difficult because we don't know how long it's going to be. But we were very used to the business of going on a 6-month operational tour, so there'll be a 3-month beat up before that as well. So we were very used to getting into the second nature of saying this is a long haul, and the early days of even difficulty and tragedy happening, we knew that there was probably a lot more to come. And therefore, in our terms, we would say the very early days, we haven't even gone across the start line. The start line starts to happen when things really get quite pressurized and difficult. So we'd always view it as a 6-month tour at least. The other thing we did, I think, was to ensure that when we could, when we were able to meet up, because we didn't have the virtual opportunities we do today. When we met up, we supported in a way that said, look, today for me is a bad day. For somebody else, it wasn't a bad day. For somebody else, it was a really dark day. For somebody else, it wasn't. Being as honest and vulnerable like that bound us together in order that we could continue with the ministry we had to do, which went on for several more weeks and months. So I would say in these circumstances, if you're involved in a cluster group, for example, I would say very clearly, get on virtually to those whom you know particularly well, and just be as honest as you can. Because what we found, and Cole and I were on the same operation, so we really do know this for ourselves, the experience of it, that it helped us to remain as resilient as we could be. So whether it was a dark day one day, an easier day the next day, we'd shared a little of our vulnerabilities. And believe me, we certainly did do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cole, do you want to add to that still?
I mean, it was quite bizarre, but this is back in 2003. That actually those groups were a lifeline, an absolute lifeline, and it was essentially part of our kind of occasion, or if you had to get out. That's critically sustaining yourself. It's very much part of you being able to minister. If you don't do it, then you're going to become a casualty and may not be able to help anyone. So I think that's really critical. But what I'd also say is it's a mindset, and that 6 months, that's a long time of your life. To be away from your family and friends, and Jonathan and I have done it multiple times. It means you're missing key events which you never get back. But we are ministers, and we are there to bless others. And what was remarkable is that while the tenseness of being away in an operational theatre for 6 months and missing your family or missing the freedom that you have back in the UK normally, was there's lots of stresses there. The reality was when I wished to get back, I found ministry quite bland back in the regular environment, because everything's heightened in an operational theatre. People are scared. Fear is a reality. It's a big dark cloud that's out on everyone's life. So people want to pray. They want to meet with you. They want you to give them some kind of comfort. And that's the opportunity that we're being given now as ministers. That people are thinking of the vulnerability of life. They're aware of their own mortality. They have no answers because a lot of people have no God, or they're spiritual or have no faith, nothing to speak into that. And we do. And I think, there's an opportunity we have here. So don't just count down the days when lockdown will end and you'll be liberated and you can spend all, go on holiday and all the rest of it. God is giving us an opportunity here. People are vulnerable. They need good news, and we are ministers of the gospel. So we have an opportunity. We have answers that they don't have. Christ has conquered death. We believe that. We're celebrating it over this weekend. So we've got an opportunity. So don't wish away. Be recognize the value that you're bringing right now as a minister in the place that God has called you to. God has put you in that church, in that town, in that part of the country. And it could be just like Ruth for such a time as this. So use the opportunity that God has given you.
And in this Holy Week, it's extraordinary, isn't it, that Jesus faced extraordinary pressure from every angle, from Judas, from the chief priests, from the soldiers. He faced massive pressure and yet proved to be able to maintain that resilience and go through what he had to go through. And extraordinarily, unlike us talking about sharing with one another, he seemingly did that just through prayer to his Father in heaven, and continued with the mission.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if we can turn to some of the questions that we've got coming in. And I'm going to put the last one that's coming up first. It's quite an interesting one. How can we help communities address feelings of corporate trauma that many have after this shared experience? And I guess, again, this would be something that you've had to deal with, where whole regiments or army bases are dealing with something that's happened which affects everyone.
I think it's a difficult question unless you have good links in with the community. If you've got good links with other leaders within the community, you can offer to bring, for example, a remembrance of some kind, an event when this is over, in order to name what's happened in that community. And there will be some places where things are particularly difficult. So you've got to link in with other people outside of your church and to find out who the leaders are and see if there is something. I mean this, not just other church leaders. I mean civic leaders, and talk about how we might be able to put something together that will be for the community. But that can only happen probably afterwards.
Yes.
Yeah.
So say a lot of it is delayed grief and having opportunity, as Jonathan was saying, when this is all over, when we can get together again to mark it in some way, and this could be a great opportunity for us to be involved with our local councils and those in power and go up to them as a minister and say, look, I'm thinking about this. Have you thought about this? Speaking to your mayor, perhaps, and saying, can we think of a day, an opportunity where the town will get together and remember people? And it could be a memorial plaque with the names of the local people. We had 2 very brutal tours when I was with one of my brigades, with both Afghanistan, Iraq first of all, followed 18 months later by a tour of Afghanistan, and we lost quite a lot of people. And one of the things we did at the end of that was to put a memorial plaque up in the local church, naming all those people and inviting all the families and friends to come and have a formal service, remembering them. And so putting a plaque up could be an idea.
And what is also key, and this is implicit in what Cole was saying, is that, of course, other people are touched by the trauma. And even now at the moment, of course, many hospital staff are being deeply touched by the trauma of what they are seeing and having to do. And even today, hearing some news from various places in London and Birmingham of both chaplains and medical staff who are involved in all sorts of things which are proving very traumatic for them. So after an event, those who are touched by trauma, and lots of people are, who are not directly involved too, are able to express something of what they feel in some corporate event that a community can put together.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. There's one question here that I think I'll seek to answer myself. It says, we are in isolation due to my wife's serious respiratory disease. I'm worried about being called on for funerals, as this would be a likely risk of COVID-19 infection. And I think probably our response there would just be, this is where, painful though it may be, particularly if the funeral is for someone you know or someone within the congregation, you really do need to lean on those who are around you, ministry colleagues, have a conversation with them as to whether they can cover for you in circumstances where you feel that you are putting somebody else at risk.
Let me give you a sort of an example from a brigade commander who told us, and Cole was there at the time, and he commanded all sorts of things in this country. And he said to us, you can go anywhere you like, Padres, on this battlefield, because you are of great value, which is great. But he said, you get yourselves in a position where other people are put in danger, and I will be absolutely not happy. Okay. So it's basically saying, don't put other people in danger.
Yeah, very, very clear. And one, I think this is from Shirley Baptist Church, and I think that's what SBC stands for here. I have my first COVID-based funeral booked, and just about to talk through the service with relatives, thinking of offering a group Skype call or similar with both. Again, Cole, I mean, when you're out in the field, presumably you are dealing with family many miles distant through virtual means rather than in person. Would that be the case?
Well, in a military context, you're really dealing with the soldiers. The family, that we have these visitation officers who eventually, when you come back, so often you do a 6-month tour, and you're dealing with the deaths and repatriation of the fallen or the bodies of the fallen back to the UK. When you then get back to the UK, then you then have a series of funerals. I mean, Jonathan mentioned that Mazkaz situation of 6 people. We came back from operations and we had a whole series of multiple funerals with the same people to go through. So it's slightly different, but I think the suggestion here of offering a Skype is absolutely right. That's what I've been looking to do with the people that have died since lockdown, is try to do as much as we can. And if we can do it online with a face to speak to with several family members, that's a really good way. And of course, that wasn't available to us in 2003. I mean, we had a phone that we used to call home once every week. It was the size of a brick. It was huge. I wasn't thinking very well. So
and that was all switched off. Of course, we had no contact. It was switched off once we went into operations. Yeah.
During the war, we had no contact at all. In fact, at the end of the war, I had the poster came up to me with 2 massive bin bags and 25 parcels for me, all in one go, which had been stored up over the course of the war fighting.
I hope they weren't perishable goods.
and they will give it mostly out of my flock. I was the person with gifts to give out.
I just want to encourage anyone who's listening to put some questions or comments in. We've got time for a few more. If you do have something to ask, do please post it and we'll try to look at it. Just flicking through some of the other questions we've got here. Haven't had many. There's just to say, I think again it may be one from Shirley that says something about son and daughter. If you want to clarify what that question is, we'll try to deal with it. I think at the moment that is all the questions we've actually got. So we might just want to just pause a moment and see if any further questions are coming in. Just gives an opportunity, Cole and Jonathan, another thing that's hasn't been addressed directly, but you feel is further worth saying, whether you would want to say something about any other topic.
I would just say about adaptability. I think that when you're in a new situation, and for Cole and I, although we've been on other things in other places, when you're faced with something that is entirely new to you, you're not quite sure how you're going to react, actually.
Yeah.
And it's important to understand that. We all think we're terribly resilient. We might be, but there may be some difficult days, and I think we have to be honest about that. The second thing I would say too is that you have to learn to adapt to the circumstances and the context. If you think it's going to be the same as you're used to, I think you could be making significant mistakes. So you have to take advice. You have to rethink some of the things you're doing in order to try and get it as right as you can.
Yeah, and I think John's absolutely right. Because we're pioneering here, don't be afraid to fail. If you want to try something and it doesn't work, you've learned it doesn't work. So that wasn't a failure; that was a learning lesson. And I think one of the things I love about the army is that with its junior officers in their first stages of development, they are allowed to make mistakes. And I think as ministers, we often get really beat up when we make a mistake because we think we're perfect, and of course we're not. We're fallen. So if you've got an idea and it looks like a brilliant idea, and you test it and it doesn't work, then you've learned it doesn't work. That's a valuable lesson you've learned. But don't be afraid of making mistakes, because when you adapt into a new situation, as we all are, you're going to make mistakes. Some things are going to work wonderfully. Other times you're going to end up thinking, actually, that was a bit of embarrassment, but you've learned a lesson.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm still looking, we haven't had any further questions, so maybe that's the opportunity for us just to pause and maybe bring it to a conclusion. So I just want to offer our thanks on behalf of the Baptist family, really, to both of you, Jonathan and Cole, just for giving your time and sharing some of your experience and your wisdom with us. It's been invaluable. I do want to say to everyone else that the webinar will be available as a recording later. So if you want to look at that, want to point other people towards it, please do. And I also just want to encourage you again, just to look out for yourself if you are facing some of the situations we discussed today. Do lean on the support of ministry colleagues or the regional ministry teams. And a reminder that the Church's ministerial counselling service is still very much open for ministers, even if face-to-face counselling isn't possible right at the moment. And you can access that, as usual, through the CMCS website. Don't come to the BU for that. You go straight to the CMCS website, and there's more information there if you need it. Finally, a reminder, we don't have any webinars next week, but do look out on the website for information about webinars in the week beginning the 19th of April. So I think other than what's already been said, I just need to say thank you for joining us, and God bless you as you continue to serve your communities, and goodbye for now.